So I've watched the sequel to Denis Villeneuve's Dune, which is called Dune Part 2. So you know which order to watch them in. And I had a great time watching this movie. I'm a fan of the Dune movies. I love the first one. It took me a while to get into the series, actually. I've never read the book before I watched the first movie. After watching it, I thought it was a great film, cinematically speaking and so on. I found the mythology and the sci-fi fantasy of it very different from anything else I've ever read or watched or experienced. And it did make me pick up the first book to read, which I did do before I watched Dune 2. And I ended up finding myself really enjoying the book more than I was expecting to based on what I saw in the film. But the book was very easy to follow and read. Considering how long ago Frank Herbert wrote the book, actually really surprised me. Very pleasantly so as well. So I was really excited to see how they adapt the second half of the book into the second part of the movie. And my overall thoughts just from watching it was, it is incredible. It was a great movie. It's something I think should be experienced in the theatre. If you can go to an IMAX screening, go to an IMAX screening. And I think you'd get more out of it than you would from watching on a streaming service or on a Blu-ray, purely because it's more of an experience that you just need to have. And I'll try and go into why I think that is the case. So, in regards to Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2, if you've never watched Part 1, I would recommend watching it because it makes the events of Part 2 a lot easier to follow, because Part 1 covers sort of the history of the Atreides family, the Harkonnens, and sets up the world of Dune. But Dune 2 is where all the action happens. Dune 1 was more world building and setup. And it feels like a really long prologue to the events of Dune 2, which feel like the main climax of both movies, basically, if you watch them back to back, which would be quite the experience if you have stamina for it, I guess. I would recommend watching on the big screen for a few reasons. So, the sound design is incredible in this movie, and it's worth watching it in a theatre with the best quality speakers you can have around you, because they use bass and other sound effects to really punctuate certain moments, and it hits that much harder. And one of the other things I found really good about this movie was the way it used some very extreme wide shots, and watching it on a big like IMAX screen where you can still see all the little details when the camera's really pulled out and you're just looking at two people in a desert, or this one amazing shot where it's like an overhead shot of all the Fremen, and you can see Paul and his mother making his way through the crowd, the Lady Jessica. And it was such a visually, like, honestly, a gorgeous shot. And I think it's one that you need to experience in the movie. I don't want to spoil any of those, but there's quite a few moments like that where you just, like, you'll be watching it and it will blow you away because of how great it looks. I've also the casting for this movie as well. Solid performances from everyone involved. I don't know what we were expecting. These are all fantastic actors. They've all done really good work and they nailed it in this movie. I don't think there's anyone out there who stood out as a weak performance. I know a lot of people will probably say Christopher Walken as the Emperor might not have been up to the same standard as everyone else, but because he's sparingly in the movie and only at the very end, I don't think it's an issue. Now, there were a number of changes made from the book, which I'll go into. So if you don't want any book spoilers, skip over this section, I guess. One of the main changes they made is the Emperor's daughter, Princess Irulan, would normally start every chapter with like a diary entry when you read the book. She's not in the first movie at all, and she only appears really towards the end of Dune Part 2. So her role is, I guess you can say, reduced. I don't know if it was really that important to the overall story it was telling. Like, you could just cut her out completely until the very end, and it wouldn't have made a massive difference, honestly, in my opinion. So I can see why they made that change. Another change they made, which is more significant, is the change to Paul's sister. The book takes place over the course of like 3 to 5 years, I think it was. So Paul has a younger sister who is born, but she's born with the intellect of an adult and speaks like an adult. So you'd have like a 2 or 3 year old talking like an actual adult would talk. And I think that would have been kind of awkward to see in this movie. So they sort of sped up the timeline a little bit and they made it so Paul's sister can speak telepathically to her mother. And that's how they had those scenes, which I honestly think is a massive improvement over how it is handled in the book, over having a child that can speak like an adult with some advanced knowledge. I imagine it would have looked very awkward and goofy on the big screen. And the one thing everyone's going to compare it to is going to be the boss baby. So I'm glad they made that change. Another change, which I discussed with a friend actually, neither of us hated it, but he's a big fan of the book and the character that the change affected. But they've expanded the role of Chani, who's played by Zendaya, by giving her some moments from Stilgar's story, essentially. Stilgar's still a very significant character. He's actually a really good character. I like the way he's portrayed in the movie. But the whole being a mentor to Paul, teaching him the ways of the Fremen, that was sort of given to Chani so she can have more screen time with Paul, essentially, and expand her role a little bit. I think that's a good change. I think that definitely is a good change. Giving her character more to do as well, and making it actually improves the whole romance between Paul and Chani by giving them more time together. But I imagine if you're a book purist, you might not be entirely happy with that change, because it does sort of bring down a character I'm sure a lot of people probably love. But me personally, I was okay with the change. None of the changes in the book to the movie are things that I would say, you know, upset me or anything, but maybe it's because I have less stake in this, because I am essentially more of a new fan to the Dune series and I'm not really a book purist or anything like that. Now, if it came to things that I don't like about this movie, I can only think of one thing really, and the runtime is quite long. It's a long movie, but there's nothing I'll cut out from this experience. And that's why I think if you're going to watch it in cinemas, because it's one thing you probably aren't going to have the time to watch again these days with so many movies, shows, video games, whatever coming out. Having free time seems like a really hard thing now. So if you can, I'd say make the time to watch it in the theaters, because it'll be better than having to make the time for it later if you're watching it on, I don't know, a streaming service or buying it on Blu-ray. I would recommend watching this in theaters. Those are my thoughts on Dune Part 2, and I guess somewhat Dune Part 1. Have you watched these movies? Are you a fan of the books? Let me know in the comments below. Feel free to bring up any points you think I might have missed, or things that you think you might not have been happy with in the movie, or you would change yourself personally. I, on the other hand, I am not really a person I would say is very easily radicalized. But after watching the Dune movies and also being a big fan of Blade Runner 2049, I think that Denis Villeneuve is the Lisan Al-Gaib of cinema. If you agree with me, comment below that he's the Lisan Al-Gaib. And hopefully I'll see you in my next video. So take care and don't forget to subscribe.